dear society members and subscribers, or may I call you friends in Hopkins. On behalf of our society, I wish to welcome you to the 2021 Monasterevin Annual Hopkins Festival on Zoom this year because of the COVID pandemic. Last year we had to cancel entirely due to COVID. Please God, we'll soon be back to our familiar live format, though I think perhaps with a Zoom element next year and in the future. We are delighted to have you with us, and we thank you for subscribing to our festival, and we hope that your experience with us enhances your appreciation and enjoyment of the works of George Manley Hopkins. While you're with us, we would like you to feel that you're a member of a family of Hopkins admirers. I'd like to dedicate the festival this year to the unsung hero of our festival, namely Mary Cassidy, who made Gerard so welcome and was such a support to him. We all need that kind of support from time to time in our lives. Sometime in the year of his first visit to Miss Cassidy, 1886 or possibly 85, we're not quite sure, Gerard wrote, "To seem the stranger lies my lot, my life among strangers." Today, I'd like to make a call to celebrate all those, like Mary Cassidy, who offer friendship and support to the stranger in their midst. I wish to welcome all of our visitors, especially those from the Hopkins UK Society. I see we have quite a large number from the Hopkins Society in UK. You're all very welcome, and we're delighted to have you. We have visitors here from the US. Some hardy souls have got up at funny o'clock. I think it's around 4 or 5 a.m. in America. And we have some people from Italy. I see Paul Kelly there. And I see Miho Takahashi from Japan. You're very welcome, Miho. And I see some visitors from Poland. We're delighted to have you all here, and I hope you enjoyed the day. I'd like to make a special word of thanks to our sponsor, Slaughter Ireland and Michael Habenicht. And I'd like to say hello to Paul Kelly here, who has been a great help to us in a Hopkins Society. And I want to congratulate him on the International Hopkins Conference they had recently. I want to make a special word of welcome to Hilary Davies, who's going to give us a lecture and read her poetry, and also to Will Daunt, who will lecture this morning. We hold this event through modern technology. However, we are not modern technologists, so please be patient if we encounter difficulties. We will strive to adhere to the schedule. And with that, and without further ado, I'd like to call on our secretary, Dan Carmody, to introduce our first speaker, Hilary Davies. Thank you. Over to you, Dan. Thanks a lot.
Good morning, everybody, and you're very welcome to the Monasterevin Hopkins Festival. Hilary Davies was to speak on at the July 24, 2021 Hopkins Festival, which unfortunately was cancelled due to COVID. Her introduction was to be by James Harper, and it is my pleasure now to deliver James's introductory comments. It is with great pleasure to welcome Hilary Davies from London to Monasterevin Festival this year, albeit in a virtual way. But it's our hope that one day she will appear here in person and enjoy our hospitality. Hilary is a poet, scholar and teacher who for many years brought her love of English, French and German literature to the girls of St. Paul's School in London. Many of her students might not have realised that their inspiring teacher was also a brilliant poet whose poems explore profound spiritual themes and describe the human condition, including love, loss and friendship, in sharp and melodious lines of poetry. Hilary has won a number of literary awards and has written 4 collections of poetry, including most recently the critically acclaimed Exile and Kingdom, published by Enitharmon Press in November 2016. From 2012 to 2016, she was a Royal Literary Fund Fellow at King's College London and in 2018-19 at the British Library. Hilary has Welsh ancestry, and her love of Gerald Manley Hopkins has been deepened by frequent stays at St. Beano's College, where she has meditated deeply on Hopkins' poems and walked along the paths and through the fields that Gerald himself trod back in the 1870s. In this talk, she will be looking at Hopkins as both a traditionalist, but also an innovator in the way he used language, and which made him an unique voice in English literature. And now I give you Hilary Davies. Please welcome her. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. And it's lovely to be in Monasterevin, as it were, and see your faces and see people joining from around the world. That's wonderful. So this morning, I'm actually going to be talking about the diversity of poetic forms and language upon which Hopkins drew to create what is a unique voice in English literature. Hopkins, as some of you may know, was a passionate linguist, a classicist by training, but one who, unlike many of his similarly educated contemporaries, had no prejudices about what constituted acceptable poetic practice. This allowed him to range across multiple literatures and verse traditions to forge a poetic language that anticipates modernism and which remains even today breathtaking in its daring. In a letter to his brother Everard of November the 5th, 1885, Hopkins expresses his pleasure. "I am sweetly soothed to learn that you could make anyone understand my poem by reciting it well. That is what I always hoped, thought, and said. It is my precise aim." Hopkins then goes on to set out what amounts to a political credo, and it's a fundamental one for helping us approach the linguistic architecture of his work. It shows us, on one level at least, what he was trying to achieve. It is this, that poetry is the expression of, his quote, "the essential elements of speech." An uninitiated reader, encountering the following lines from his 1887 poem, Harry Ploughman, for the first time, might be forgiven for taking issue with this. And here it is. "Wind lily locks laced, churls grace too, child of a man's strength, how it hangs or hurls them. Broad in bluff hide his frowning feet lashed, raced with along them, crag iron under and cold furls, with a fountain's shining shot furls." Yet Hopkins writes of this poem in a letter to Robert Bridges that although highly wrought, the rhythm of this sonnet is for recital, not perusal. And that if the ploughman does not leap in a vivid figure before the mind's eye, the sonnet fails. We may argue here that Hopkins has reached the farther shores of his style, and indeed there are critics who have done so. But his hopes of conjuring a vivid image are not entirely naive. Again and again throughout his correspondence and papers, Hopkins insists on the spoken nature of what poetry should be and of what he is trying to achieve. My verse is less to be read than heard. If you do recite the whole of Harry Ploughman straight through without stopping to dissect every clause or verbal construction, the tautness, tension, and movement of this farm labourer behind his plough and his massive horses, which Hopkins was so keen to convey, do astonishingly come through. The reason for this is that the poem is an excellent example of another definition Hopkins gives in his lecture notes on poetic rhetoric. Quote, "Verse is the recasting of speech into sound words, sound clauses, and sound sentences." In other words, Hopkins reminds us that in poetry, meaning resides not just in units, in individual words, nor in the received rules of syntax that must govern prose, but more crucially, in how these cluster and resonate together like keys and harmonies in music. However, to break the rules, as everyone knows, you have to know them. Hopkins's intellectual background was an ideal one for a personality that from a very early age was fascinated with words. His family placed a high value on cultural accomplishments. His father had literary pretensions, reviewing for the Times and the Cornhill magazine, and was the author of 3 volumes of poetry that may be described as conventional in sentiment and competent in versification. One of Hopkins's brothers, Lionel, became one of the leading sinologists of his day, and his uncle Charles worked and lived for many years in Hawaii, becoming a citizen, learning the language, and founding a family. In short, completely acculturated. So the Hopkins family was, at least in terms of openness to other living, even exotic languages, untypical of its contemporaries. By happy chance, the curriculum of the school he attended powerfully fostered Hopkins's natural interest in language, philology, etymology, the nuts and bolts of language, but also in the associative, evocatory power of words and the historical and cultural freight they carry. This was Highgate School under the headmastership of John Bradley Dine, an infamous bircher whom Hopkins disliked intensely. Nevertheless, he had raised intellectual standards, and under his aegis, Hopkins received not only a rigorous training in Latin and Greek, but was also introduced to French and German, subjects normally thought much less worthy of study at that time. This all gave him a good grounding for the greats he studied at Oxford. He was ferociously well read. In his letters and journals, he mentions Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, Moschus, Democritus, Tacitus, Virgil, Cicero, Aristotle, Heraclitus, Ovid. All read, of course, in the original. His own teaching notes on rhetoric, prepared when he was teaching at Man Raiser House, Roehampton, display an encyclopedic, even obsessive, knowledge of ancient Greek verse forms that even then must have bewildered the average seminarian. Words like palimbachius, amphimacia, procosmlatic, first epitrite. I'm sure you're familiar with all of those things. Whatever his students made of these lectures, such lists do demonstrate how much such things mattered to the emerging poet. Hopkins was also versed not only in the art of translating from the classical authors, but also in rendering more modern writers like Shakespeare and his contemporary and friend Robert Bridges into Latin as a form of poetic discipline. Such exercises have the virtue of defamiliarizing poetic language and giving Hopkins other ways of thinking about rhythm and stress. In so doing, he perceived that, and this is a critic John Lewis Band talking, the Greeks did shift their prosodic values with apparent ease and great artistic advantage, and that a similar process was necessary in English. Indeed, the relationship of Hopkins' experiments to Greek literature has been touched upon by Brian Arkins in a lecture at this very festival in 1990 called Heraclitean Fire, Greek Themes in Hopkins. That he was equally well read in English literature is axiomatic. And this allowed him to become proficient in conventional versification from an early age. In the opinion of one critic, Elizabeth Schneider, I quote, "The dominant impression left by Hopkins's early verse is of this remarkable technical mastery of a variety of difficult forms in which he permits himself no liberties. It is scarcely matched in the juvenile writing of any other English poet." It was this mastery that proved to be the scaffolding towards the construction of the extraordinary edifice of Hopkins's mature poetry. He is serving an apprenticeship, approaching the various ways different poets and languages create in order to think both consciously and unconsciously about his own practice. From an early stage, it's obvious he wishes to break with what he saw as the predictabilities of English verse as she had come to be written. He is critical of what he called running rhythm, the mellifluous and perhaps not entirely native flow of English verse that he felt the educated reader of poetry had come to expect. It's all too cozy, too self-consciously poetic, and does not engage with the qualities that inhere in the language as such. This makes it a travesty of what it should be. Individual poets, too, can lull themselves into doing what they do most easily and successfully. This kind of verse he called Parnassian. It is spoken on and from the level of a poet's mind. Great poets have each their own dialect, as it were, of Parnassian, formed generally as they go on writing. And at last, they can see things in this Parnassian way and describe them in this Parnassian tongue without further effort of inspiration. So, where was he to find the sources that would feed his poetic development? We're back to Hopkins's insistence on the natural speech rhythms and stresses of any given language. Hopkins's approach to this is fascinatingly close to the notions of inscape and instress, to which he gave a more general application in relation to God and creation. Each language has its own unique character and cultural aureole, by which I mean everything that lies in the psychological hinterland of its speakers: geography, history, art, literature, religion, music, architecture, landscape. This came home to him in a serendipitously fecund way when he moved to St. Bynoes in North Wales in 1874. Arriving in a strange land, looking out over a spectacular landscape, for the college has panoramic views to the sea in Snowdonia across the fertile vale of Clwyd, in a place where the local people still routinely conversed in another mother tongue. All this helped to release the burst of confidence and poetic energy that so famously produced the wreck of the Deutschland and the great sonnets of praise. These did not, as we have seen, come out of nowhere, but there clearly was something fertile about being in a place which felt simultaneously different and yet familiar. Hopkins fell in love with Wales and the Welsh language. I have always looked upon myself as half Welsh, and so I warmed to them, he wrote to his mother within days of arriving. How much direct contact he had with the local people is debatable, but he was soon taking Welsh lessons from a Miss Jones, and most importantly, now trying his hand with prosodic forms in a new language. This is quintessential Hopkins. For this he came. He leapt without fear into what the Princeton Encyclopedia of Poetry and Poetics describes as the most sophisticated system of poetic sound patterning practiced in any poetry in the world. The peculiarly rigorous Welsh system of metre and rhyme composition, which is encompassed in its many different manifestations under the term conganedd or harmony. It is not for nothing that one of the names for this art form is cerddafod, or tonguecraft. The complexity of and the sheer number of the different forms are frankly dizzying, and I can vouch for this. But the important element to retain for our purposes with regard to Hopkins is the concept of sound patterning, both of consonants and vowels. This requires patterns of consonants, not just individual ones, to be repeated twice within a line. Wales's difference from English as a language makes this, Welsh's difference from English makes it very difficult indeed to produce to happy effect in English. Nevertheless, Hopkins was keen to practice this form and wrote one example of a coedd in Welsh itself in 1876. In February of the following year, enclosing God's grandeur and the starlight night in a letter to Bridges, he writes, "The chiming of consonants I got in part from the Welsh, which is very rich in sound and imagery." In the starlight night, we find lines that correspond to Conganedd Gytsain, a two-halved line where the same pattern of consonants is repeated in each half. And I've kind of put them in bold here so you can see what I mean. The grey lawns cold where quick gold lies. So you've got GLC, GLC twice, and another GLL at the end of the line. And another one, it is all a purchase, all a prize, PS, PZ. And slightly adapted in the caged skylark as a dare gale skylark scanted in a dull cage. So you've got DL, SK, K, SK, DL. He tries also what's called Conganedd Zain, where a line is in three parts, of which the first two rhyme and the last two have a consonant pattern, because the Holy Ghost over the bent, you can see OOTT, and other examples with a few variations are this night, what sights you heart saw, thy river and o'er gives all to wrack or wrong. To add to this, there's the chiming of vowels. The precise rules that obtain in Welsh are too complex to go into here. But suffice it to say that Hopkins approximates to them, and so often that it is evident he has paid close attention to the tightly structured effects they produce. Here's an example with a flood or a fall, low, lull off, or all roar. And when consonants and vowels pattern together, dwindled and thinned to a fringe of a fingernail, these interlacings bind the language together like an illumination in the Lindisfarne Gospels or the Book of Kells. The bedrock, however, of Hopkins's poetic edifice is English. But what do we mean by that? Modern English is rather crudely put, a fusion of underlying Anglo-Saxon with some Norse structures and vocabulary and huge semantic additions from Anglo-Norman French, late medieval French, and the languages of education for so many centuries, Greek and Latin. But the carol of English, as Hopkins says in another context, remains Germanic. However many words we borrow from elsewhere, nothing is going to change that. If we go back to Harry Ploughman, the poem I cited at the beginning of my lecture, what is striking is that it contains very few words not based in English or its wider linguistic family, the Germanic languages. No Greek, only 2 Latin words, knave and liquid, a smattering of Anglo-Norman and French, fountain, feature, crimson, crew, furl. But the majority of the words he has chosen are the essential elements of Anglo-Saxon English. Still less is the language he uses the refined and educated branch of the English language that had become associated with poetry since Spenser and Milton, or at least in Hopkins's perception of it. He despised self-consciously poetic language. It is dead. In a letter to Bridges of August 14th, 1879, he explains that it seems to me that the poetical language of an age should be the current language heightened and unlike itself, but not an obsolete one. What attracts him about a dialect writer like the Dorsetshire poet William Barnes, for example, is that the language guarantees the spontaneousness of the thought and puts you in the position to appraise it on its merits as coming from nature and not books and education. And that's from such a well-educated man. So Anglo-Saxon verse is highly alliterative. The line is divided in 2 with corresponding consonants on each side of the break. Here's a line from Beowulf from the 6th century, translated by Seamus Heaney, and mentioned for its alliteration in his introduction to the poem. The fortunes of war favoured Hrothgar. This tradition is still powerfully at work 7 centuries later in the Middle English poem Piers Plowman. Here are some lines which demonstrate very well the enduring importance of alliteration in English poetry. My modern rendering, another 6 centuries later, still depends upon it. I was weary, forwandered, and went to meet a rester under a broad bank of Beerbourne side. And as he lay and leaned and looked on the waters, he slumbered in a sleeping. It swayed so murray. Please forgive my not very good Middle English pronunciation there. I was weary with walking and went to rest under a broad bank by the side of a stream. And as I lay and leaned and looked at the water, I fell into a slumber, watching it swaying. Hopkins's knowledge of Anglo-Saxon literature may not have been deep, but it was in his linguistic DNA. He knew and had read Piers Plowman, and of course he evokes it in the very title, Harry Ploughman. This Anglo-Saxon influence is present everywhere in his poems. Wiry and white fiery and whirlwind swiveled snow from the wreck of the Deutschland. Most frequently, Hopkins uses a different alliteration in two halves of the line. That's different from the 6th century system. And examples of this are legion in his work. The whirl and the wheel from the Wreck of the Deutschland. The roll, the rise, the carol, the creation to Robert Bridges. Their ransom, their rescue, and first, fast, last friend. The lantern out of doors. One could go on, and I hope that you will try and have a look at some from your own reading. A smaller but distinctive influence on Hopkins's practice is a feature that Anglo-Saxon shares with Norse. Unsurprisingly, they're both Germanic in origin, and they were both spoken for centuries in Britain. Hopkins's Roehampton lectures show he had at least a passing acquaintance with Icelandic verse. And there's one particular feature which occurs in what's called skaldic verse that I want to look at. Skaldic meaning the poetry of the poets, short recited pieces which celebrated the feats of warriors and kings and sometimes criticized them. The trope I refer to is called a kenning. It's a circumlocution, almost a riddle, in the form of a compound instead of a more concrete single word. Here are two Icelandic examples, both referring to blood. A simple one, raven wine, and a more extreme one, ale of the goose of terror. You can see from both how they can be used to add layers of association and symbolic meaning, how they make the poetry richer if handled well. So kennings are both old but made new by Hopkins, and again they're everywhere in his work. Here are just a few choice ones. Circle citadels for the heavenly constellations at night. Starlight wender for a pilgrim. Heaven gravel for hail. Wolf snow to convey the jaws of a winter storm. Sometimes another element can arrive in the middle, splitting a word or phrase for emphasis. A rhetorical figure called Tmesis. Here's John Donne, whom Hopkins admired, doing just that in his hymn to Christ. In what torn ship soever I embark, that ship shall be an emblem of thy ark. What sea soever swallow me, that flood shall be to me an emblem of thy blood. Hopkins frequently uses this trope with great innovativeness. Fallow boot fellow for Tom's fellow journeyman or day labourer in Tom's Garland. Dappled dawn drawn falcon, the famous one in the Windhugger. Drop of blood and foam dapple from the May Magnificat. Forth and flaunting sun from the furl of fresh-leaved dog rose. So in Harry Ploughman, broad in bluff hide, his frowning feet lashed, we have a complex example referring to the feet of the ploughman, encased in his leather boots, running along the furrows. And here is the spectacular, but actually quite easy to understand, wimpled water dimpled, not by morning matched face of youth and beauty, in the leaden echo and the golden echo. The overall effect is to increase the density of what he's able to say in a tight space, to heighten the essential elements of speech quoted at the beginning of this lecture. There is one more crucial feature of Anglo-Saxon or Old English that is significant for one understanding what Hopkins was trying to do. Old English poetry uses a system of accents or stressed beats with an unfixed number of unstressed beats per line. In other words, the number of syllables in each line or segment of line can vary very much, and what gives the line its structure is its beat, This is because English is what we call a stressed or accented language. All words of more than one syllable, however, carry a natural stress or beat upon which the speaker lingers, however briefly. Take any example you like, e.g. enter, bottle, weary, associate, and try pronouncing it with a stress laid somewhere, but where it normally falls. Bottle, weary, associate. It immediately sounds rather like the two Englishmen masquerading as French policemen in the English sitcom Allo Allo. You can test this out for yourselves at home with your families if you like. All of this means that such languages depend on a beat for their form in poetry in a way analogous to music. They are naturally imbued with the dynamism and muscularity that arises from beat. A moment's reflection will tell us how much these two attributes, dynamism and muscularity, are characteristic of Hopkins' style and his famous sprung rhythm. Hopkins is acutely in tune with his medium, and this makes him not only one of the renewers, but one of the great reinventors of English poetry. We can get an understanding of what Hopkins achieves from an unlikely source. It's a passage from sound and symbol, music, and the external world. In this ambitious work, the 20th century thinker Victor Zuckerkandl sets out a model of the relationship of music to time and to being. For him, what gives us the sense of shape and movement in music is the interplay of notes and meter with the overarching structure of a wave. Where and how the notes or tones come in relation to that wave both determines and takes life from that wave. Here's what he says. Sorry. To put it metaphorically, the ground upon which the tones fall is in wave motion. They may be regularly or irregularly distributed. At one place close together, at another spread thin, may follow the pattern of the measure with the accents or run contrary to it. The tones give the constant basic form of the wave a changing, perpetually different profile. It will display contours, now soft and rounded, now sharp and jagged, will beat softly or with ever-increasing impact, will heave, topple, break against resistance. There could hardly be a better description of what Hopkins is doing in his poetry. Indeed, in his introduction to the Wreck of the Deutschland, he reminds us of the closeness of the two art forms. Sprung rhythm is the rhythm of all but the most monotonously regular music. Hopkins's practical practice of renewal and invention allowed him to write longer or shorter feet than he thought convention allowed. But these nevertheless have a pronounced internal beat and rhythm that any native speaker of English can instinctively hear. With swift, slow, sweet, sour, a dazzle dim. Let us remind ourselves for a moment of those two key words for Hopkins, in-stress and inscape. In-stress is that shaping power which flows into creation from God and gives it form. It is the dynamic stress which binds things together and things and the beholder together, revealing the divine source of creation. Inscape is that particular and dynamic combination of characteristics and form that each thing has, a pattern unique to that one being. Crucially, as Hopkins says in a letter of 15th of February 1879 to Bridges, design, pattern, or what I am in the habit of calling inscape is what I above all aim at in poetry. So we shouldn't be surprised that his poetry has inscape in abundance. But in creation, pattern is not arbitrary, nor without reference to what surrounds it or where it came from. Uniqueness is not monism. Creating anew is to create out of the creation that God gives us. This idea, applied by Hopkins to the nature of creation and God's movement in it as a whole, applies equally well to the thisness of any given language, and, mutatis mutandis, to the thisness of any work of art, the distinctive voice of the poet, artist, or composer. In short, to Hopkins. So his use of language, the inscape of his poetry, is a blend of his imagination, here akin to in-stress, and what he had learned from studying the systems of the languages we have looked at. They are the tradition on which he drew. Yet by fusing all the influences that have worked on his mind into a completely new and inimitable poetic language of his own, Hopkins makes it new. As we draw to a close, I'd like to return to the use Hopkins made of ancient Greek language and ideas. He actually made very little use of his deep learning in classical literature to inform the themes of his poetry. I think it's because he both knew it had been done to death in English literature and intuited that the wellspring of his inspiration was his native tongue and northwesterly European poetic tradition. But this doesn't mean that the aureole effect of what he had learnt did not cast a light on his work. And there is one late poem in which thought from very early Greek philosophy and theology figures. And I would like to finish by suggesting how the edifice of this poem connects to our topic today. It's a poem with one of the most extraordinary titles in English literature. That nature is a Heraclitean fire, and of the comfort of the resurrection. Hopkins, as we noted above, read Heraclitus in the original, and his interest as a linguist will have made him highly receptive, not just to his thoughts, but how Heraclitus uses language. The entry on the philosopher in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy references Charles Kahn in his Art and Thought of Heraclitus to identify two traits in Heraclitus's style: linguistic density and resonance. I think we recognize this. Quote, "The former is his ability to pack multiple meanings into a single word or phrase. The latter, his ability to use one expression to evoke another. Heraclitus loads his words with layers of meaning and complexities that are to be discovered in insights and solved like riddles. His words are designed to be experienced, not just understood." How apposite this is to Hopkins's own style. So some of the tropes we have identified with Anglo-Saxon, Norse, and Welsh have their counterparts in Greek too, such as the insertion of alien grammatical elements, compression, and the inversion of normal word order for emphasis. We have come full circle to a place where Hopkins's double immersion in the classics and the Christian tradition is now expressed both in the subject matter and the very style and the syntax used. Hopkins has taken a complex of apparently disparate ideas and fused them into one of the most innovative and revolutionary poems in the English language. Being and becoming, form and movement, change and eternity are all actually embodied in the language, words and structures meant to be experienced, not just understood. I'm not going to read you the whole poem, as I want to suggest you do this at home, out loud, just as Hopkins wanted, and enjoy rolling his language around your tongue and your brain. But here are a couple of pointers to close with to show what I mean. In the first 2 lines, Hopkins calls up the paradoxical nature of clouds. They move swiftly across the sky, yet are almost ever present. They carry immense power, yet are made of substances you can barely see and certainly not touch. Listen how the rhythm, alliteration, assonance, single stops, and multiple syllabled feet show you this, holding the meaning together, by turns slowing the speaker and then hurrying her along. Sorry. Cloud, puffball, torn tufts, tossed pillows, flaunt forth, then chevion and air. We meet it again in the writhing of light through foliage, shive lights and shadow tackle in long lashes, lace, lance and pear. Man's evanescence parallels that of the clouds, and the rearrangement of ordinary syntactical order brings us up short against this terrifying fact. Both are in an unfathomable, all is in an enormous dark drowned. Man shape, death blots black out. Then, with the exhortatory exclamation, enough, the language calls a sudden halt. All the grief of change and loss is swept away in the remarkable way Hopkins makes the language embody the halt in history that is the resurrection. The risen Christ offers the hope of redeemed life in him. In a flash, at a trumpet crash, I am all at once what Christ is, since he was what I am. Because Christ has partaken of humanity, man can partake of divinity. And we have their fusion in the final fusion of Hopkins's language. We hear his symmetry, his use of symmetry, alliteration, assonance, compression, all that he had learnt. Here, creating a voice as unique and tightly structured as the diamond of which he speaks, a crystalline density unequaled in English poetry. This Jack, joke, poor potsherd, patch, matchwood, immortal diamond is immortal diamond. This is what Hopkins was searching all his life to achieve, and he has succeeded. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening.
Thank you, Hilary. That was an inspiring talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So if anybody has a question, I'm very happy to try and answer it. It's a huge subject.
Well, may I say that there was so much density in your talk. You obviously have put an enormous amount of thought into it, and it certainly comes across the work that you've put into it, and similarly the work that Hopkins obviously has put into his poetry.
Well, thank you. It's huge fun to do. I'm a bit of a linguist myself, so I had rather a ball doing it. You know, it's so nice to be asked to do something that that actually is sheer pleasure to be asked to do. Yeah.
That's marvelous.
So I'm seeing a question. Somebody's sent a question to me. Somebody's asked how much was St. Bino's crucial to Hopkins? Imagine if he hadn't been transferred there, would his verse have taken another direction? I think it would certainly have worked on other material. I think, yeah, I do think that it would be very, very difficult to imagine the Hopkins that we know and love without him having gone to St. Bino's. You know, however much you think the actual Welsh language may have been important to his development, there's also the question, which of course I deliberately, you know, the lecture was not about the themes of his poetry, it was about the language he uses, but the themes that were released by his experience of being in Bino's are, you know, would they have, you know, we know that he produced really, you know, very different poetry or very little once he was in Liverpool, in the slums of Liverpool. So I do think that kind of huge, wide open natural landscape was a kind of natural landscape to let his gift out. Yes, I do. He responded well to that. And somebody else has asked, do you think he had too much linguistic knowledge? That's an interesting question. I think that somebody, I think if you look at his his non-poetic prose and his journals, you know, and I've mentioned those lectures on rhetoric, Hopkins definitely had some kind of obsessive compulsive trait, because when he looks at a thing, he goes into it and into it and into it and into it and into it. He almost loses, you know, the sense of the wood for the trees. And those lectures on rhetoric are simply, they're almost impossible to read. I mean, God knows what the poor seminarians would have been doing. You can just imagine, you know, the 19th century seminarian equivalent of playing with their mobile phone, you know, under the table. And we know that he produced fits of laughter in St. Bino's because of the way he used to do his little sermonizing over supper. They ate in silence and somebody would talk from the pulpit. And there's a famous account of how he just went on and on and on about make the men sit down, so much so that eventually they got an attack of the giggles. And once, as we all know, once a group of persons gets an attack of the giggles, it's almost impossible to stop. So yes, I don't know that he had a problem processing it. I think Robert Bridges had a problem processing it, if that makes sense. Now somebody was raising a hand. Did I see a hand raised?
Hilary, we have a question from Michael Kerwin if you look in the chat.
Oh, okay, yes. The Irish language. I'm not, you know, I'm writing from the perspective of a writer and a poet. I am not, you know, I haven't read absolutely every single scrap that Hopkins ever wrote and that is still extant to us. So I can't answer your question about whether or not he engaged with Irish. It's very curious that he speaks quite happily about Welsh and not nearly so much in his, you know, in his letter. Well, he doesn't talk about Irish, and he talks about the Irish and the Irish question. And it's obvious from that he is so distressed by the whole situation in Ireland that perhaps this pushed him right back from learning the language. It's really unfortunate because he was well placed to do so. But I think we all know that Hopkins was a bit of a nationalist. I wouldn't say a chauvinist or a jingoist, but he was a bit of a nationalist, and the whole Irish thing really, he found it a terrible conundrum, I think, and difficult to handle. So I think he just seems to have had much more of a natural affinity, you know, imagined, if not real, with the Welsh than the Irish. Yeah. Somebody has asked, why was the reading public so unready to receive Hopkins's verse? I think most of us can answer that just by reading it out loud. Don't you? People have criticized Bridges for sitting on the stuff. I mean, he did publish one or two tiny little things in anthologies, which, you know, nobody's kind of noticed. And I think that was probably Bridges' intention. Not that it shouldn't be noticed, but he only chose stuff that would be acceptable. So nobody commented on it because it was acceptable. but sitting on it until the end of the First World War. I think I almost rest my case by saying that he published it at the end of the First World War, and that at the end of the long 19th century, and surely that was actually, the more I think about it, the less critical of Bridges I feel about that, because I can't imagine what would have happened actually if a lot of the stuff had been published in 1890. I don't, we can all speculate. It could have been exciting, but it might have been just too weird, I think.
I believe he did submit poems for inclusion in some of the internal Jesuit publications. But
oh yes, I mean he did. He wanted to be published, and of course, famously, the Wreck of the Deutschland was the Wreck of the Deutschland. Can you imagine? The Wreck of the Deutschland was actually submitted to the tablet and accepted by Hartley Coleridge, who then clearly thought better of it or got cold feet or whatever and said no. And I think actually that's rather a good what's the word, the word for experiments, a controlled experiment, that he did take it. He recognized something, and then he thought, I don't think I can possibly do this, and said no. So yes, he did submit the Wreck of the Deutschland, correct. And he definitely wanted recognition in his lifetime, that's for sure. Yeah. Somebody's asked, do I have a personal favorite poem? One that's not so well known. I think my personal favorite is The Nature is a Heraclitean Fire, I have to say. That's kind of why I finished with it. But one that's not so well known. Gosh. Oh yes, I do have a piece which you can find in the major, Caradoc's soliloquy from his unfinished verse play. Hopkins had no dramatic talent at all. No wonder he never did this. Having said that, if you look, and it is in the the standard stuff like the major works paperback, Caradoc's soliloquy after he has cut off Winifred's head is absolutely hair-raising. It's, this is a time before Freud. I'm not saying that what he writes is Freudian, but if you read it carefully, what Hopkins has done is he's perfectly put before you the pathology of a psychopath, because Caradoc does all the things that psychopathic murderers do. He says, comes in and, he's done it. He says, horror. Well, of course, she asked for it. I mean, if she'd agreed to, if she'd agreed to do what I wanted, she brought it on herself. That's a classic piece of, of pushing responsibility away. And then he turns again on it, and he remembers the horror, and he remembers her eyes turning as the head rolls down the hill. Her eyes. So he's kind of haunted, and he goes, no. She was a vile thing. She brought it on herself. And have a look at that soliloquy. It's really alarming, and it's alarmingly good psychologically. So don't know if that answers your question. Hair raising, yes, head raising. So, but we all have our own favorites, I'm sure. Was that Irene raising her hand, or? Fair enough. How nice to see you again, Irene, or after all this time.
Yes, it is, Hilary. It was in London, wasn't it?
It was indeed in the British Library. Mm-hmm.
You were giving a series of lectures. At was it a seminary?
I know. I think I was when I was Royal Literary Fund, maybe at the British Library, and I was doing workshops there. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
that's right.
But thank
sorry,
you,
dear ladies, for a sec. Sorry,
we're just absolutely wonderful lecture. I did enjoy it thoroughly. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, everybody, for being such good listeners so early on a Saturday morning. Yes. So many thanks to all who've attended. And I think now we're moving on to Will's lecture.
Yes, I think we'll take a break for a few minutes.